Hi, welcome back to the Discipler Group. I'm glad you're here. We enjoy working with you, and I particularly enjoy hearing the stories about what you're doing in your congregations and how working together has really enhanced your ministry. So thanks for coming. You know, one of the things that I do from time to time is watch some of these television shows about designing homes and designing different rooms, how to put colors together and drapery and different fabrics and carpeting and all of those things. I actually like design, and I like seeing things come together. You know, in many ways, God was a great designer. I mean, you look at creation and how all those pieces come together. And when I think of one of the greatest worship events of all time, the Pentecost and the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, I think about how God put all of those pieces together at that one time and brought them together for a powerful experience. Worship is very much about thinking, what is it that people need, and what are the elements that we bring together as it relates to music and visual arts and the sense of hearing, the sense of speaking, even smell and touch, and bringing all those pieces together so that people have an experience that works together, that brings them into a closer relationship with God. I've experienced some of your worship services and really have just marveled at the ministry you're doing in your congregations to bring worship alive and to make it meaningful. Today we want to continue to explore that. With us is Reverend Marcia McPhee. She's a worship consultant and also a professor. And she's going to talk with us about our role as designers of worship, bringing the various elements together so that they all speak powerfully to people and help them to transcend the place and space and time and move deeper into their relationship with God. So thanks for coming. I encourage you to be playful in worship. I encourage you to experiment in worship. And I encourage you to continue to think about how does worship become so powerful that it inspires people to grow deeper in their relationship with God. Thanks for all you're doing. May God continue to bless you and your ministry.
Hi, I'm Dr. Marcia McPhee. I'm a worship consultant, a professor, a designer of worship, and a leader of worship. I am what I call a ritual artist, and so are you. I say this because there's an art to facilitating the worship of the people of God. There's an art to telling the story, the faith story, in ways that transforms lives and forms disciples for Jesus Christ. I had the pleasure of growing up in a little tiny United Methodist church in Missouri, Main Street, Adrian, Missouri. And in that little church, they nurtured me as an artist, as a ritual artist. They let me dance, do pantomime, play piano and organ by the time I was 10 or 12 years old. I know that the roots of my ministry are there at that little church. Later on, I had the pleasure of being a professional dancer and musical theater person in New York City for many years. And so I come at this from an artist's perspective, and then went to seminary and found a theological foundation for it. So some of us come from the arts into ministry, but some of us go into the ministry, hear a call to the ministry, and then find out that we have to be artists, because worship is an art. But no matter which end we came from, we're all right here in the same place as ritual artists. For we work with a palette of words and music, visuals, and action that come together to tell the greatest story ever told, to tell a story that can help shape our lives, can help us learn to walk in the ways of Jesus Christ, can help us open ourselves to the Spirit of God so that we might be the body of Christ in the world. So there are two tools that we need for this ritual artistry, I believe. One of them is the gift of imagination. Imagination. New ways to tell the age-old story, because inevitably Christmas comes around every year. Easter comes around every year, and we tell that story again. How can we tell it in fresh ways that can sort of wake us up to the messages of hope and liberation within those stories? Now, here's the good news. Imagination is something that we've just got. It's just part of us, made in the image of the Creator. It's part of who we are. You don't have to go to a workshop to get it. You don't even have to watch a DVD to get it. you've got the gift of imagination. In fact, I think that our greatest asset is the community of imaginations working together to figure out how to tell this story, how to facilitate the worship of God on a Sunday morning. One of the things that I like to teach is processes to help get more people on board, to plan together, to perhaps season by season get a couple of new people in on the worship team to help create new ideas, fresh energy, new perspectives. Nobody tells the same story in the same way. I'm sure you've noticed that. When you're sitting around the dinner table, you're remembering some story, nobody has the same version. But this is actually a wonderful gift. If we can incorporate more people into the process, not just participation in worship, not just leadership in worship, but also the planning process, then liturgy becomes literally what it means, the Greek liturgia, meaning liturgy, the work of the people. The second tool that I think we need is integrity. Now, oftentimes people say, yes, we have to have worship that has integrity. Usually the subtext to that means we need worship to stay the same. But actually integrity, the correct use of that word integrity, means that all the parts contribute to the whole. Every part, the words, the music, the action, the visuals, all the parts contribute to the one message. You know, in this day and age of communication, it's really important for all the pieces to come together to work for the whole. We have to move away from what I call plug and play worship. You know, the kind of worship where you have the order of worship and you plug in the hymns, you plug in the anthem, you plug in the scripture, you plug in the call to worship, plug in the sermon and hope to God that it all has something to do with each other. Instead of plug and play worship, I want us to move. In fact, it's kind of a paradigm shift. Move to what I call intentional design. Starting with a message and saying, how do all the pieces work together? So that visual artists, preachers, liturgists, musicians are all working together from the get-go to design something that will become what I call good worship. That's meaningful and memorable worship. So if we're bringing all of these pieces together, oftentimes people call it creative worship. I try not to use that term, actually, because it's not specific enough for me. I really want a term that's descriptive of what we're trying to do. And so the term that I use these days is sensory-rich worship. Utilizing all of the senses. Now, we've been talking about multi-sensory worship for a couple of decades now. It's nothing new. But I want us to think about it in a little different way. Just because we have music and words and visuals and action does not mean that we're using the senses to their fullest potential. What I'd love for us to explore is the way that all these things weave together to create the message. It's something I call think like a filmmaker. How do we take the music and underscore words in a way that helps us hear differently? Or take an action with a visual object and have it move through the space during music or during speaking that can bring another dimension to the message proclaimed. This is what I mean by sensory-rich worship. Now, folks who study cognition and memory, neuroscience, can help us out with this. Did you know that by the 6th grade, out of every 10 learners, there are 2 who learn through primarily auditory means, 4 who learn primarily through visual means, and 4 who learn primarily through tactile kinesthetic means, by doing. Now, what does this say for our worship, for our means of communication in worship? Well, it means that if we're relying primarily on verbal means of communication, we're cutting ourselves off from some of the most powerful forms of communication that we have at our disposal. So I want us to really take seriously the 3 V's, I call them: the verbal, the visual, and the visceral. I'm always thinking of the 3 V's when I'm designing worship. The verbal is everything that we hear. Sounds, all sounds, including spoken word, speech, music, instrumentation, and even silence. Silence is a sound. The visual is everything that we see, from objects to colors to lighting to even how we're configured in the space as a body, whether we can see each other or not, whether we're looking at the backs of heads or whether we can see faces. That's all part of the visual. The viscera is the guts of us. So the visceral are all the things that we do, that we body forth. One of the most important questions I ask myself as I'm designing worship is this: how do we embody that which we proclaim? How do we embody that which we proclaim so that we're not just talking about hope, talking about reconciliation, talking about liberation, but we're trying it on for size? We're actually doing things that help us to understand what it means to live in right relationship. One of the things that I've really enjoyed researching is neuroscience, the brain and how it thinks, cognition, memory, emotion, and what that has to do with ritual and what's going on in there in our worship. One of the things that neuroscientists tell us is that cells that fire together wire together. There are different centers in the brain that are taking in different kinds of information. And the more we can have firing off around any one message, the more we're likely to remember it and get that good experience. In other words, meaningful and memorable experience. We remember it beyond the time and place of worship. So if we're getting information through the verbal, through the visual, through the visceral, the more things that are firing off together, the more we'll remember it. Let me give you an example. I was with a church in Napa, California, and the message for the day was the work of our hands as the work of God's hands in the world. So one of the things we had the youth do was to set up tables in the narthex and put fabric on them. And they had some washable magic markers. Washable is key because it will get all over your hands. And as folks came in the door to church that morning, they put their hands down on that fabric and the youth drew around their hands. And so by the time they finished, they had all these pieces of fabric with their hands all over. And during the opening hymn, they processed that in and they dressed the altar, they dressed the baptismal font, they dressed the pulpit. They even flew one of them up as a banner. And so we saw all of these hands, not just any hands, but the hands of the people who had come in. Then I preached on this very theme. And towards the end of my sermon, as I often do, I gave a cue to the pianist. And she began to play Precious Lord, Take My Hand underneath the end of the sermon. And I invited folks to a prayer poem, a blessing poem. And this blessing poem was about the work of our hands. And so it said things like, blessed be the hands that have held pain. Blessed be the hands that have reached out and been received. Blessed be the hands that have worked for justice. A whole litany of kind of blessings. And as I was doing that, the music is playing underneath. And of course, it's a familiar tune to many people. It was setting a mood. It was helping us hear better. At the same time, on the screens, we had pictures of people, and they were reaching out to one another, or they were working, or they were helping each other, or they were comforting one another. And so all of these senses were working together at the same time to help bring home that message. Now, if that's not enough, just hang on. At the end of the blessing prayer, what I did is I asked them to turn to someone next to them and take their hand and say, blessed be the works of your hands. And to turn to someone else and take their hand and say, blessed be the works of your hands. And then I had everybody stand up and we sang, Precious Lord, Take My Hand. So you see, we didn't just talk about blessing hands. We actually blessed hands. And all of that was undergirded, that whole message was undergirded with the sights that we saw, the sounds that we heard, the things that we did, all to bring a meaningful moment that I've heard people say they have never forgotten since then. I certainly haven't. So what we've been talking about is something I call layering. Layering, that's the concept, where the music and the words and the visuals and the actions work together, not in little boxes, layering. Or what I call layered sequences, like the one I just described. Now, how do we make this happen? How do we make it happen? Well, let's all say it together. Plan ahead. The only way we can really make worship and art utilize our artistry in this is to plan far enough ahead so that we can have time to go through a creative process, to think of these things, to let the community of imaginations also work on it together. So planning ahead. One of the key ingredients to planning ahead is not planning for one Sunday at a time, but planning in chunks of time. So in 4 or 6 week segments, whether that's a sermon series or whether that's following the liturgical year. This is not antithetical to lectionary preaching. It's really how the lectionary compilers put things together, following the liturgical year. And so the liturgical year is a wonderful structure to use to plan ahead in chunks of time. Another reason to plan ahead in chunks of time is because we learn, again, back to those cognitive processes that make worship meaningful and memorable, we learn by having some things repeated. We don't want to have all new stuff. Creative worship is not about having all new stuff all the time. You know, monotony comes in many forms, and change can be as monotonous as no change. So what we want to do is have some repetitive things within a season that helps to ground us, to help take us deeper and deeper into a message over the course of a few Sundays. This is also one way that we can do this sensory-rich worship without getting burned out. So you're not going to be recreating something every Sunday. The same set of visuals is going to work for a whole season. You may even have a call to worship and a certain song that you begin every service in that season with. And so you start out with a sort of template for that chunk of time. And then you change within it from Sunday to Sunday, but it's not something completely different. It's something that takes us deeper and deeper and deeper into that theme. So friends, I hope that what you've heard in this short time together is that you are a ritual artist. Even if you haven't thought of yourself as an artist before, you are a ritual artist. There is something full of beauty, full of creativity, that is our creative process around worship design. I hope that you've heard that all the senses are important to help us make worship meaningful and memorable, and I hope that you've heard, finally, to plan far enough ahead so that you can enjoy the process. You know, the only difference between a rut and the grave is the depth. We all get into ruts, but usually it's when we don't give ourselves enough time to really enjoy the creative process that is facilitating the worship of the people of God. Thanks.